Oh, and yeah, and of course, and sometimes people, sort of put up offensive things I've said on YouTube, so you can catch me there as well.
Yeah. Well, listen, it is an honor to be fighting from the same trench with you, Douglas. I couldn't
Well,
ask for a better
likewise, Sam.
company. So until next time,
Likewise.
take care, my friend. Well, this is an addendum to the podcast, delivered 5 days later. And I said a few things in this podcast that were gifts to my critics. I was aware of this at the time, but it's always interesting to see how far these people will go to mislead their own audiences about my views. Just to give you a taste of what's happening online, Max Blumenthal, the fake journalist, son of Sidney Blumenthal, tweeted the following quotation from my podcast, quote, "I'd vote for Ben Carson every time, ... He understands that jihadists are the enemy," end quote. Well, that ellipsis is obviously doing a lot of work there. I'd vote for Ben Carson every time. Okay, he tweeted that out to the world. This is just the digital death rattle of journalism. The fact that anyone on earth considers Blumenthal a journalist, including Blumenthal, that is just all the proof you need to understand that we are on the precipice of something horrible. And Cenk Uygur did the same thing. He retweeted a meme about my intending to vote for Ben Carson. He also made a series of increasingly deranged videos about me in the last few days. He appears to be suffering some sort of breakdown. But the problem is, of course, this works. I'm now hearing from people who say, I've read all your books. I used to be a huge fan. The fact that you are supporting Ben Carson for president is a deal breaker. What the hell is wrong with you? Now, you do know how freaked out I would be if Ben Carson became the Republican candidate for the presidency. You know that, right? I can assure you that if he does, I will be far more articulate on the reasons why he shouldn't be president than Max Blumenthal or Cenk Uygur will be. Okay, now, do these guys know that they're misrepresenting my views to their audiences? Of course they do.
But if you say, well, the Muslims are irredeemable, and if ISIS has the weapon, and back then even there was no ISIS, but some dangerous Muslim has the weapon in the Middle East, and we drop a nuke on him and kill, in his book he says, tens of millions of people. Mm-hmm. Well, most of the people there are innocent, but then do they really count as much as the people in Arkansas and Tennessee? No, of course not. They're Muslims, right?
He's so intellectual. What an intellectual heavyweight.
To say Ben Carson is better than Noam Chomsky and he thinks he's an intellectual heavyweight because he figured it out. It's the Muslims.
This is conscious deception of their own audiences. It's amazing to me that their audiences don't seem to care about this when it's so blatant. But I should clarify something here. My remarks about Ben Carson and Noam Chomsky were simply a statement about how dangerously out of touch with reality the left appears to me on this issue. And I consider Chomsky the largest influence here. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of Chomsky's views. He considers himself an anarcho-syndicalist. Now, how that differs from Marxism, you're welcome to write your dissertation on that. Good luck. But on this specific topic, the threat of the global jihadist insurgency we are now witnessing, he's an anarcho-masochist in my book. All he ever seems to do is cite the ways in which the U.S. has been terrible. And some of these charges are true and some are fictional, but all seem to terminate in a kind of moral confusion and political paralysis. If aliens from outer space arrived tomorrow and began exterminating us, I'd half expect Chomsky to get on Democracy Now! And say that we deserved it. After all, we've been putting out so much electromagnetic pollution and space junk. It's no wonder the neighbors are pissed. Now, in the last few days, many people have hurled quotations at me from Chomsky, attempting to counter what I said about him. But these quotations demonstrate no more than that he knows that jihadists exist and that they occasionally kill people. The explicit message of everything I've heard him say in this area is that jihadists wouldn't be killing people or trying to conquer the world but for the crimes of America. Okay? And that is a suicidally stupid thing to believe. To see where his head is of late, I just watched the first 10 minutes of a video entitled Noam Chomsky, Media, NATO, ISIS, Free Trade Agreements, and Humanity. 2015, new. Okay, that's the title on YouTube. I just watched the first 10 minutes, but Here, Chomsky can't even seem to figure out why we oppose Soviet communism. Okay, according to him, it was just a, quote, pretext for our own greed. Chomsky uses this term pretext all the time. Everything is a pretext. Every stated noble motive is always a pretext. Okay, any concern about human rights is a pretext. Okay, needless to say, our concern about jihadism is also a pretext, he makes clear in this video. My concern about jihadism isn't a pretext for anything but the maintenance of civilization. Okay, and this kind of self-flagellation would be disastrous if it ever came to power in this country. So, the fact is, when it comes to dealing with the global challenge of jihadism and Islamism, I would take our own theocrats who recognize the problem for what it is, even with all their crazy religious topspin, over delusional leftists who don't. Now, you can disagree with me, fine. But if you are horrified that I could say such a thing, well, that just proves my point. Okay, I've been worrying for years that there will come a time when even atheists and secularists will back Christian lunatics because they're the only ones making sense on this issue. Now, we're not there yet, but if you are horrified by what I said in this podcast, or by what Douglas Murray said, and you think we are totally wrong about the left, well, great. Then consider us the canaries in the coal mine. We are living proof that people like Noam Chomsky and Glenn Greenwald and all the rest of these far-left critics of capitalism and Western power and U.S. foreign policy can seem so terrifyingly confused about what is going on in the world with respect to this issue that it's possible for a liberal rationalist like myself to prefer even the Christian right to them as stewards of Western civilization. Again, happily, we won't be faced with that choice in 2016. Okay, I'm sure I'll vote for Hillary. But Hillary, as you know, is derided as a neocon warmonger by the far left. Great, let's hope she stays that way. Now, it shouldn't surprise anyone at this point that Glenn Greenwald got into the act after this podcast was released. First, he noticed the New York Times review of my book with Majid, written by Irshad Manji. Apart from a couple of barbs that struck me as a little unfair, which were mostly directed at atheists in general, and at Salman Rushdie and Richard Dawkins, and as well as at my fans, I liked this review a lot. Okay, I was grateful for it, and I spread it on social media, and I also thanked Irshad for writing it. Okay, it was in fact a very positive review. She ended it by calling Majid and me role models. What would Glenn Greenwald, a journalist, mind you, have you understand about the contents of this review? Okay, well, he seized upon a paragraph in which Irshad criticized my fans. And here's the quote. Even secularism's better angels have trouble defeating the tribal mindset. Last year I attended a Sam Harris event where a crush of fans trailed him, mob-like, around the venue. Oi. End quote. And Greenwald, the journalist, this person is covering world events, right? Described my fans this way while forwarding this quote on Twitter. The planet's creepiest, most tribalistic, leader-worshipping cult. End quote. It's not ISIS. It's not Boko Haram. It's not the Lord's Resistance Army. No, it's you guys. You're the planet's creepiest, most tribalistic, leader-worshipping cult, according to Glenn Greenwald. Okay. But Glenn wasn't done with me. He had a busy day over there at The Intercept. He then tweeted the following summary of what you just heard in this podcast. Syrian refugees, : Sam Harris defends Ted Cruz's, quote, preference for Christians over Muslims, end quote. Blasts Obama for objecting. Well, that's almost right, but it would take a Talmudic scholar to parse that accurately. Glenn knows that anyone who reads that summary will think that I supported Cruz's demand that we let in only Christians from Syria. And that's not true, as anyone who actually listened to the podcast could have told him. As I said, I think secularists and liberals in the Muslim world, and this certainly includes any who are fleeing Syria, should be given U.S. citizenship if they want it. I said these are the most important people on earth to support. How many different ways do I need to say that? My only concern is that we not let in jihadists or their sympathizers. The point I was making about Cruz is that if in the process of vetting a family from Syria, we determined that they were Christian, well, then that would cancel any concern that they might be jihadists. Is it safer to let in Christians? Of course it is. Okay, Cruz is absolutely right about this. But insofar as we can vet people, unlike Cruz, I think we should let in Muslims as well. We could be letting in the next Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or Majid Nawaz, or Faisal Saeed Al-Muhtar, or Sarah Haider. These people are absolute heroes. I mean, Glenn Greenwald isn't fit to tie their shoes, and he's not making their lives any easier, I should point out. The kinds of things that Glenn Greenwald says and writes here materially raises the security concerns of just these sorts of people. And I acknowledge in the podcast that the problem of vetting refugees appears to be quite different in Europe than it is in the U.S. at this moment, which is a good thing for the U.S. So if you came away from this podcast thinking that I want to abandon the Syrian refugees to the chaos of Syria, you're completely mistaken about my views. But we have to be able to talk about the kinds of concerns that Douglas raised. And if we're just letting in people by the millions in Europe without proper vetting, no one should be surprised when we discover that a significant percentage of these people resist assimilation and have attitudes about free speech and women's rights and gay rights that are deeply problematic and, in fact, antithetical to our own. And Europe is going to have to deal with that. And they've done a terrible job of it so far. And Douglas's only point is, what makes you think this job is going to get easier if you let in millions of more people fitting this description? And that's, we have to stop walking on eggshells around that problem. And cries of racism and bigotry from the left is causing all the good people to walk on eggshells and leaving a space that can only be occupied by the real bigots and xenophobes and fascists and neo-Nazis. And again, this is especially a problem in Europe. And Douglas is absolutely right. If Europe ever makes a hard turn toward the right politically, it will be because of how the left handled this issue. And while I recognize that the U.S. is in a much better position here politically than Europe is, it's still conceivable to me that we could eventually find ourselves in the same situation. And it would arguably be worse in the U.S. ultimately because the far right here is generally synonymous with Christian theocracy in the making. If you have to think of a plausible scenario under which we would elect a true Christian lunatic to the presidency, someone who actually believes that the prophecies in the book of Revelation will come true, they're a true record of the future given to us by God and are likely to come true in his or her lifetime, well then, it will be because of how the left handled this issue. It won't be because of gay rights or transgender rights or global climate change. No, the left's failure to deal with the increasingly obvious security concern of jihadism will be what opens the door. At least that's the only path I can see. And it's all too plausible given the likelihood of future terrorist attacks. So, as I said in the podcast with Douglas, we have to prepare our political landscape for the virtual inevitability of those kinds of attacks. It will be a miracle if we avoid them entirely. And Muslims, above all, have to anticipate this. Muslims have to want to prepare the political landscape to absorb these shocks. And denying the problem, shrieking about Islamophobia, leveling charges of bigotry at everyone, including ex-Muslims and Muslim reformers who are trying to tackle this issue, that is ostrich-like behavior that could well end terribly for all of us.